Well, good afternoon. It's about time for us to start, about 1 p.m. So I appreciate everybody being here. It's a little bit a larger crowd this afternoon. I'm encouraged to see everyone here once again. As always, if there's any questions throughout the study, then please stop me, interrupt me if you have anything you'd like to add. Today we're going to be studying the Greco-Roman context of the early church. So last class period, if you were here, you remember, or if you've watched it maybe, there was the Jewish culture is what we went over. So we went over everything from the different sects of Jews, from the Pharisees and the Sadducees to the chief priest. And we talked about their kind of day-to-day life and their Jewish culture. Well, today is going to be the inverse side of that. We're going to talk about the Greco-Roman culture around the Jewish culture. So really, the Jewish culture that we studied was a very small part of the world. If you remember this map that's behind me here, we kind of looked at this map a couple classes ago to talk about the conquest of Alexander the Great. So all of this stuff in orange you see above my head, that's the conquest of Alexander the Great during his conquering all the way down from, was up in Macedonia, and he went all the way down to Egypt down here, which was ruled by the Ptolemies after he died. All the way over to India is where he conquered. And so most of the world was under Greek control. Well, this led to a Greekifying, if you will, which is the term we often use as Hellenizing of the world. They spoke Greek, they thought in Greek, and this is kind of what we're going to study, what that culture was like. Because to put the Bible, the New Testament, back into its context, we have to understand that for a lot of the world, it was a Greek context. So they were breathing the air, they were walking in the streets of the Greek civilization, and even the later Roman civilization. By the first century, land east of the Mediterranean had been thoroughly Hellenized. Historians classify the period from 323 BC all the way to 31 BC as the Hellenistic era. Now, as we know, for most of the world, that Hellenistic era stuck around for much longer than that. They actually continued to be Greek for much longer. Egypt, the Balkans, Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, and the Fertile Crescent were all Hellenized to varying degrees. The culture that existed in these areas previously was not erased or anything like that, but they were melted into a larger pot of Greek culture that many local cultures didn't have at the time. Now, the local cultures didn't vanish away, but they were blended in to make a hybrid of different kinds of cultural expressions. These cultures blended together, and this is actually why the Greek-Roman culture prevailed over time, because they had all these different influences that they grew and learned from, and is why they became so powerful. Now, the primary instrument by which Greek culture spread was through language. The Greek language became the primary language and remained that way long after even the Latin-speaking Romans came into power and took over the world. People still continue to speak Greek. Greek was the primary language for trade, government, the military, philosophy, and even religion everywhere you went, except, of course, in most communities in Israel. But even in Israel, in the communities of Israel, where they weren't necessarily speaking Greek in all of their liturgy, throughout the Jewish diaspora, many people read the Old Testament in Greek. It's what we call the Septuagint, was written in Greek. It was the first translation of the Greek Old Testament. Now, we'll talk more about that towards the end of this class. But many people think by the 2nd century BC, we already had a Greek Old Testament. The Septuagint was written. And this was the Bible for most Greek-speaking Jews around the world. Now, another instrument of Hellenization was the polis. This is P-O-L-I-S. This is the Greek word for a city-state. Now, Rome started out as a polis. You can kind of think of a polis as a way that Greeks used to kind of turn certain regions into a Hellenized culture. They would take a small city-state, a little city, and that would become a hub of Greek culture. You can kind of think of it the way we think of cities like Dallas or Tampa or maybe Cleveland or these Denver, these big cities that we think of, and they have everything, right? You don't need to leave that city for anything because they have everything right there. Now, for the Greek way of life, what it means for a city to have that Greek culture, these hubs would have included religious centers, temples and idols, gymnasiums for training young men, academics for teaching philosophy and rhetoric, academies, an agora, which was usually a public meeting place, a market of some kind. It's where we get the word agoraphobia. And even amphitheaters or stadiums for sports and arts and different things. So these things would have been started with a Greek gymnasium. So we have this in almost every city we go to. We have a gym, right? Maybe multiple gyms. There's lots of gyms in Wichita Falls. Well, the gym that we have today started with a Greek gymnasium. For the Greeks, mind and body were not two separate things you would train separately. Mind and body were intertwined. And so to become gifted rhetorically or to be gifted with your academically, you would also need to be training your body as well. They had to be exercised in unison. Now, gymnasiums were primarily for young men to train their bodies as well as their minds. Plato is said to have spent lots of time in the gymnasium. That's how he got his nickname, Plato. We usually think of that as his first name, but it was actually a nickname, which meant big shoulders, because he was a wrestler in the gym. And so that was his primary hobby. Now, you can kind of see a picture behind here of what, I don't know if you can see that or not actually, but it was sort of a courtyard, a grassy courtyard that was surrounded by some pillars and things like that. Part of it may have even been shaded. And they would do everything from lift heavy objects to running back and forth, running laps, wrestling, things like that. And it's where the Greek Olympics came from. Those small gymnasiums, people would train there. Another place you might have had in a Greek city-state or a polis is the Greek Academy. This was started by Plato in about the 3rd century BC. And this academy was especially to teach rhetoric and philosophy. So you would have been able to teach there, but it would also be a place for you to discuss with your peers different ideas or different concepts you may be having, or ask questions that the world may want to know. Another place you would probably have is a Greek amphitheater. An amphitheater, basically that means a half circle, because that's what they were. If you go to the Colosseum in Rome, it's a full circle. It's one of the only ones that was all the way around people could sit. As you can see here, there's a picture here of what the ones that were brand new might have looked like. And then beside it, this is one that's partially reconstructed. So this part is all old, and then the stairs, of course, have been reconstructed around it. But these were places to display anything of beauty and culture and art. Some things not so beautiful, like gladiator fights and certain different animals fighting people, animals fighting each other. They would, basically anything you could think of, they would put in these amphitheaters. Most importantly, for the Greeks, in every polis or hub you would go to, there would be a temple. This was a religious center of the Greek people. This was maybe dedicated to a single god or goddess, maybe to a couple god or goddesses. Maybe the temple was dedicated to all of the gods and goddesses. But there would always be one, at least, maybe 2 or 3 temples in each city. Some cities were known for their temples. We know a few of those from the Bible. And this kind of brings us to the third instrument by which Hellenization took place. And that was through what we call religious syncretism. So this was done by identifying local deities with the Greek pantheon. So you would go to a small region or area in the ancient world, and they may be worshiping some god that was, had a lot to do with the water and helped them with catching fish and things like that. And the Greeks would say, no, you don't worship Dagon or whatever they may call him. You actually worship Poseidon. That's what we call him. It's the same god. And so this syncretism of religion was basically a way of the Greeks spreading so that everybody worshipped the Greek pantheon. So listen, we have a God for that, and it's probably the same God you're worshiping anyway. The Samaritans readily did this in the 2nd century BC by identifying Yahweh, the God of the Bible, with the Greek Zeus under Antiochus IV, and then later as Jupiter, the Roman equivalent of Zeus, under the Roman Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD. This helped assimilate local gods and goddesses to the Greek and then later Roman pantheon. If you remember, the Greeks and Romans had the same gods, but the Romans had their own names for them. Like we said, Zeus was Jupiter. Juno was the Greek or the Roman equivalent of Hera, and so on. Greek culture influenced different places in different ways. Judea, for example, reacted with a mixture of acceptance and resistance to the Greek way of life. Jesus and his disciples lived in a semi-Hellenized culture. Greek culture was far different from Judean culture, but of course, those two things couldn't help but influence each other in some ways. So to understand Rome's rise to power, we have to understand that it actually started as one of these small Greek city-states, way down in central Italy. Now, as they rose to power, they actually did so by conquering other Greek city-states, going from hub to hub and conquering those places as well. While Rome was an empire in the geographical sense, as they gathered land, they were not an empire in the sense that they had an emperor. So who knows how they governed themselves before they had an emperor? That's right. They were the Roman Republic. That's where we get a lot of our way of governing today in America. They were a republic, and so they would vote on things. They had a Senate made up of 100 members that would vote on things. Maybe the main difference is these senates weren't always elected by the people, but the members of these senates were often elected by each other instead. And so before they had an emperor, they were a republic. Rome's first emperor didn't come until 100 BC, and his name was Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was the first emperor, although he never was actually referred to as an emperor. Instead, he was crowned dictator for life, which is basically just another term for emperor, right? Now, once he crossed the Rubicon and killed Pompey, if you remember from our couple classes ago, General Pompey was the one who rode into Israel, rode into Jerusalem, took over the city, and he waltzed right into the Holy of Holies and declared, they don't have a God here, because he didn't see any idols in their holy place in the temple. Well, General Pompey was defeated by Julius Caesar, and then, of course, Julius Caesar was declared dictator for life. This didn't go over well with the staunch Republicans who didn't want to have a dictator, and he was killed in 44 BC by those staunch Republicans. Now, after Julius Caesar's death, Rome entered a series of civil wars. Those loyal to Octavian, who was Caesar's son, and Mark Antony, who was Caesar's friend, were on one side, and then Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, were on the other. Now, Octavian and Antony won a decisive victory in 42 BC, but their own relationship deteriorated eventually as well, as they struggled for power. Octavian defeated Mark Antony and his Egyptian lover, Cleopatra. If you remember, Mark Antony and Cleopatra were tied together. And he won a decisive victory at a naval battle in Actium in 31 BC. Now, Octavian was unopposed, and he returned to Rome, declaring himself the bringer of peace to Rome. He restored the Republic, he brought peace to Rome, and nobody was fooled by this. They knew that he didn't restore the Republic. Instead, he restored his father's reign as a dictator, and he became the second emperor of Rome. He was given the honorary title of Augustus, meaning venerable or majestic. And, I'm sorry, I don't know how that got on there. Anyway, he was given the title of Augustus, which meant venerable or honorable, and he moved on to rule Rome, bringing peace. This is the period we call the Pax Romana. If you remember, the Pax Romana was peace to Rome, where Rome wasn't fighting. All of the people were wealthy and had lots of money and peace at the time. This victory wasn't so joyful after all. Actually, Rome's victory led to crowded cities. It led to sick, dying people. It led to all of the people that were displaced returning into these big cities and making them almost uninhabitable. The crowded streets led to high rates of unemployment, crime, disease, and high mortality rates. After the civil wars, Rome had no desire to bring its former soldiers back to an already overcrowded streets of central Italy. And Roman colonies popped up, and they served as some like miniature Rome governments that would basically be where they housed all the soldiers. So they would have these places like Corinth, Philippi, Lystra, Antioch. These were Roman colonies where they basically stuck all of their soldiers after they won wars. They would give them land in these smaller cities. If you recognize a lot of these names from our Bible, that's because most of them are in our Bible. We have in the New Testament lots of people preaching and teaching in these small Greek colonies or Roman colonies. Religion for Rome was the Roman interpretation of the Greek pantheon, as we already said. Their religion also included the worship of Roma, which was a personification of the Roman people, the Roman nation. And that was usually depicted as a woman, sometimes sitting down. You might have seen it on some old Greek coins, some old Roman coins. They also worship Augustus himself, and he would sometimes demand their worship. Now, there was also another term that they could worship called the genius. Now, we have that word which means usually a really smart person. It didn't mean the same thing in Greek. So the Greek genius would have been a part of you. So everybody would have a genius, which is basically the deified personification of yourself. So it was invoked in things like oaths or marriages. We don't really have much of an equivalent today, but even places could have a genius. This was called a genius loci. And this was the spiritual essence of a place, maybe a river or maybe a field or something like that, or a mountain. And it would have a genius loci. This was another thing that was often worshipped or maybe depicted in different ways. Religio, which is where we get our word religion, in Greek, it meant to bind together. This was usually referring to binding heaven and earth, the spiritual and the physical. That's what religion did, and that's how religion served the people in ancient Rome and Greece. Now, the economic scale of the urban Greco-Roman world was not much different than the economic scale we looked at in Jewish culture. The main difference is how they were named. The senatorial class, that was the wealthy Roman nobility, the very top of the economic scale. The equestrian, or sometimes called the knight class, which isn't to be mixed up with the knights of the medieval times. This was an aggregate of less wealthy people like Pilate, Marcus Felix, and those given less power than the nobility. The decurion were the leaders of smaller provincial cities and councils. They often acted as local community magistrates or maybe judges of some kind. The plebeians were the general citizenry of Rome, including small farm owners or worship leaders, as well as small business owners, would have been the plebeians. Now, the freedmen were ex-slaves, who often relied heavily on their former masters. Second-generation freedmen were still considered freedmen themselves, but through skill and determination, they could rise in the ranks a little bit. Slaves, of course, once again, are at the bottom. They were considered little more than property. Slaves made up 30% of some urban cities. Your status as a slave depended heavily on the status of your master. Slaves of high-ranking officials often came with its own sense of importance and legitimacy. Now, slaves could be freed only in two ways. They could be freed by paying the ransom of their master, or they could be freed by being released by their master. These were the only two ways a slave could be freed. Now, what's interesting is how this played out in the church. So we may be surprised to find that people of all different classes in the Greco-Roman society were part of the church in the first century. There were many from the higher merchant classes, but the largest block of people were from the lower echelons and even from the slave population. People like Philemon, which we have a whole book written after or named after, were part of that slave population. This at times led to problems in some of the first churches like Corinth, where the wealthy members were unwilling to give up their rank and privilege among the maybe less fortunate members of their churches. Christian noblewomen faced their own set of problems. The dilemma they faced was that there were often a shortage of upper-class men in the church. And so they faced the decision of marrying a pagan man who was maybe a higher status in society, or marrying a Christian who was probably going to cost them their rank in society. This was a decision that a lot of them had to face, as there were more women in the church than there were men in the first century. Now, religion, philosophy, and culture are all tied together. So to understand the Greek-Roman culture, we have to understand the religion, the philosophy, and of course the culture itself. Well, how do you understand a culture? To understand any culture, we have to understand what it is. Now, we have a culture in America today, and we share the culture through the things we know and things we pass down. These are like stories, myths, events, traditions, media, and more things. These are the roots of any culture. American culture in general, and even Southern culture in particular, has deep roots, even though we're a relatively young society. Many of us know who Scout and Boo Radley are. We know who looked unwaveringly into the camera and declared, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman," right? We know who says, "Shaken, not stirred." Bond, James Bond, right? We know our own cultural heroes. We know people like Davy Crockett. We know George Washington. These are the people that define our culture, what it means, right? Well, we have to understand that the Greek world and ancient cultures had their own stories, their own icons and heroes. They would have been familiar with Homer's Iliad, Virgil's Aeneid. They would have been familiar with their own literature, art, architecture, and poetry. These are the things that made up their world. So they had their own sense of culture and what that meant. Gods and idols would have been a big part of their culture. Gods and idols were everywhere. They were as common for them as cardboard boxes are to us today, right? We see them everywhere we go. In fact, as a former Pharisee, we see Paul among the prevalence of gods in Athens, and Luke records what he sees when he walks around Athens. All of these idols and all of these gods. Now, as a Greek Pharisee, or as a former Pharisee, you can almost imagine a germaphobe walking around a crowded county fair. This is how Paul was feeling around all of these idols. You can see him getting worked up over it because of what he sees. Greek religion was not reserved for temples and academic halls. Religion was found in homes, it was found in markets, public places, government buildings, and even sporting events. It was a world full of gods. They lived in a God-soaked culture everywhere around them. When Paul preached the gospel in places like Thessalonica or Ephesus, he wasn't suggesting a new hobby for a few hours a week that people might pick up. He was suggesting a community-wide heart transplant for everybody in the community to change everything about them. Their religion was the glue that held everything they did together. Jesus' followers gave up all associations with the religious and political cult of Rome. This was a threat to those in charge and those who relied on the religious identity of their city and community. It's hardly surprising that Paul's teaching and his work in various places started riots and fights where he went. He was causing a ruckus wherever he went. Now, to understand the Greek and Roman religion, as we've said, and this is the primary thing to understand about Greek religion, Roman religion, it was everywhere. For the ancient world, religion was not a private community of believers who held to a certain body of beliefs and practices. It wasn't a code of doctrine meant to separate people from secular culture. In fact, the way we think of secular culture today, we define it as a society separated from religion. This did not exist in Rome. Society and religion went hand in hand. Everything about it was hand in hand. As we said earlier about religion, it could mean binding together. Another term that it could often be used is scruples. That's what religio meant for the Romans. Now, the main term that Christians used in the New Testament for worship was not religion, actually. The main terms were piety, godliness. Those may be used interchangeably. As also worship and service were the terms used for New Testament Christians to describe their worship, their religion. There's a few ways that they are similar, but we must understand that religion in the ancient world existed in a very different setting from modern religion. Let's explore some of the ways that that worked. So we said that Roman religion could mean either binding together or scruples, and we said that it is everywhere. But what are some of the differences? The main difference is the concern with the present life rather than an afterlife. So in our religion today, as we meet here on the first day of the week, we look forward to a time after this life is over when we will be in an afterlife with Christ and God forever. While Christian promises a life after death, the ancient world had diverse views on afterlife. While emperors may become gods after death, some believed in reincarnations while others denied an afterlife at all. Still more thought that once they died, they would maybe join the ranks of the people lost in the underworld, in Hades. Service to the gods was to obtain earthly gifts and favors, maybe good crops, security, boons, blessings, and helps in the here and now, not in a life to come. Another difference is the focus on cultic ritual rather than doctrinal belief. It wasn't about a set of things that you believed about the gods. An ancient writer, Cicero, he did write about the gods and what different people thought about how the gods operated and acted. This was of little consequence to most of the Greeks. Most of them were more concerned in how you offered a sacrifice or how you performed your religious rites. It wasn't necessarily about doctrine or what you believed. Number 3, there was no secularism with the separation of church and state. We already talked about this a little bit. Secularism, broadly defined, is a social and cultural norms absent of religion. Once again, this did not exist in Rome. Religion was a statecraft. It was used by those in power to control their subjects. Roman religion was at times so flexible that Caesar could fashion himself as a high priest, pointing people towards who they should worship or what attribute they should do. And then at other times, he could fashion himself as a god who needs to be worshipped and praised and to be lifted up on high. Participation of entire cities during religious rituals was common. Everybody had to participate. There was no opting out. There was no closing your door and letting the parade happen outside your walls. Number 4, pluralism, but not necessarily tolerance. Ancient Rome had gods for everything, from war, strategy, and hunting, to farming and fertility. Pagans in that time often critiqued both Christians and Jews on their worship of one true God, as they said. They liked to say that Yahweh is just another name for Zeus, or Jove, or Jupiter, Ammon, and all the other most high gods that people claim to have worshipped. Even some of the Hellenistic Jews fell into this trap, worshiping their God as if he were a Roman or Greek god. Now, this doesn't mean that the pagans were always understanding and tolerant of other religions. A Roman nobleman once advised young Octavian to hate and to punish people who did not participate in worshiping the Roman pantheon. For similar reasons, Jews were expelled from Rome 3 times, no less than 3 times. 139 BC, Jews were expelled from Rome, again in 19 AD and 49 AD. Jews often refused to participate in Roman worship and ceremonies. They also often caused problems by fighting amongst themselves and causing disagreements amongst themselves, which just caused problems in their cities. In summary, Greco-Roman religion was not just a part of the culture. Worship of the Roman gods was fused into every aspect of the culture and daily life. For a newly converted Gentile Christian, this would have been an entire crumbling of their worldview and rebuilding from the ground up. Jews did not have to change religions, but they did have to accept the Messiah and the fulfillment of their religion. Now, the Jewish Christians, while they didn't have to change religions, the Gentile Christians absolutely had to change everything. You know, we talk about this today sometimes. We say, you know, that person is so close, or this person is just a few steps away from being a Christian. In reality, for most of our world, to become a Christian, you have to change everything. You have to change how you think and how you act and what you believe. This was a big step for many Jews and many Christians as well. Now, we also want to talk about Greco-Roman philosophy. There's maybe a hesitancy to talk about philosophy in the church, as a lot of times I've heard people, not maybe here, but I've heard people in many churches say, oh, we don't need any of that. Philosophy, that's secularism, or even proclaiming it as evil in some ways. But once again, we must divorce our preconceived notions of philosophy and understand it as it was understood in the ancient world. Philosophy was not just a high-minded academic study for people with nothing else to do but sit around and think and pontificate all day. Philo is the Greek word for love. Sophie is the Greek word for wisdom. So philosophy was the love of wisdom. It was the love of understanding, the love of asking questions and trying to answer them. It permeated everything, from religion to politics to rhetoric, art, and science. It reflects on the purpose of everyday life. Philosophy asks the meaning of things, from art and ethics to agriculture and nature, and even asking the meaning of life itself, which is still a question asked today. To understand philosophy, first of all, of course, we have to understand Socrates. Socrates, from 469 to 399 BC, is regarded as the first great philosopher and the first philosopher martyr as well. Cicero said that it was Socrates that brought philosophy down from the heavens down to earth. He saw philosophy as a matter of practical living, focusing on virtue mainly, first and foremost. He also focused on ethics, religion, and religious disposition. As a public intellectual in Athens, Socrates lived in a very tumultuous time. Athens had just been defeated by Sparta at the very end of the Peloponnesian War. Throughout antiquity, Socrates was remembered for personifying the highest ideals of philosophical virtue. He quoted an examined and examining life. That's the way he was said to have lived. He lived by the teaching and the wisdom that he so often proclaimed. Plato was Socrates' pupil. Plato taught that the world of space, time, and matter were mere shadows of the ultimate reality. The world of forms and ideas are the invisible realities of which this worldly thing are just mere copies. Plato also taught that the human soul is immortal, and when our outward bodies pass away, our souls live on for all eternity. That's where we get the terms of the mortal coil, right? That our true bodies are just mere shells, and that the inner soul truly longs to be in heaven. That was Plato's idea and his thought. And it influences a lot of Western culture today. So Plato was also known for the founding of his own school, This school was called the Academy, as we talked about earlier. This is how the Greek Academy started with Plato. And it's gone through many changes over the years. At the beginning, it was kind of agnostic, not really believing if there was a God or not, but understanding it was a difficult question to answer and not one that should be quickly understood. Later on, they kind of changed the way they thought. By the 1st century AD, the Academy had given way to what may be loosely termed Middle Platonism. This is in reference to Neoplatonism, which happened much later. Middle Platonism was a sort of religion in and of itself, and something that probably would have been encountered by the church. People think Middle Platonism probably came from Jewish interface because it had a lot in common with the Jews and their religion. Aristotle was Plato's star pupil. Aristotle was not part of the Academy, but was from northern Greece, where he returned after Plato died to teach a young Macedonian named Alexander, who, shall we say, moved on to great things. If Plato had a flair for the abstract, Aristotle was quite the opposite. He focused on the concrete categorization of things and places and even people. He was interested in behavior and beliefs. He even tackled areas as diverse as biology, rhetoric, virtue, music, aesthetics, metaphysics, and logic. Aristotle returned to Athens in 335 BC, and he started his own school just outside of Athens called Lyceum. It became known as the Peripatetic School because of the tendency of its students to walk to and fro as they would discuss ideas. These are the main three philosophers. So if you ever want to understand anything about Greek philosophy, these are the big three: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They knew each other. Socrates, as we said, taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. And these are kind of where all the other philosophies hail from. Other ones to mention, there are a few worth mentioning. Epicurus from 341 to 270 BC. Epicurus believed that people should practice what he called undisturbedness, a kind of carefree attitude, happy, unafraid of death. He thought anything that was painful was bad, anything that was pleasurable was good. Good and evil didn't really exist. They were merely aesthetic. Zeno, from 333 to 264 BC. Zeno, with the help of others, produced what we call Stoicism. This school taught people to see God in everything, from the air we breathe into the things that we create, and to see it as one single deity, which is actually pretty close to maybe the truth. We have to understand that, of course, none of the people in the Bible necessarily agreed with everything the philosopher said, but there are things that we can see they had in common. Some things they may have gotten right. Let's see. Another one we can look at is Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes formed what we call the Cynics. The Cynics are the Greek word for dog, because they considered themselves to be the watchdogs of society. Cynicism was an antisocial critique. It was a critique against everything from the human way of life, what our values were, from having children and caring for people to maybe even chasing after money and wealth. It believed that all humans at the core were corrupt. If you know the word cynicism today, it's not that far off. And it's actually what a lot of people tend to believe. It's not very far away from the postmodernist belief about humanity. Philosophy in the Bible. In some cases, Paul displays his familiarity with Greek philosophy and poetry. I'm thinking things like Acts 17, 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul even goes so far as to quote some Greek poetry. Paul does not completely sync with any particular philosophy, and in some cases the New Testament writers even refuse to be associated with such teachings. With Jesus and his followers, we see a mixture of adaptation and confrontation. Jesus himself quoted an ancient Greek proverb, "Physician, heal yourself," when he is making a point about the people in Nazareth not accepting him in his own hometown. Yet he also cautioned his disciples to not be like the Gentile leaders who jockeyed for position and power to lord over one another. While Paul shared the Jewish critique of Greco-Roman religion and worship, he still lived in the same world and breathed the same air. As writer and speaker, Paul showed evidence of rhetorical training, even though at times he said that he didn't come preaching with any rhetorical skill or elegance. Many have drawn similarities between Paul's thought and that of the Stoic writers, especially in ethical theory. The Gospel of John tells the story of Jesus through very messianic Jewish terms, but at the beginning, he says, in the beginning, the Word was with God, the Word was God. That word for word is the Logos. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Logos is not only a Hebrew or Jewish term, it's also, the Logos itself was a Greek word. But it wasn't only a term he was pulling from the Old Testament, it was also a term he was pulling from Greek thought and philosophy. He's borrowing a Stoic idea from the 6th century BC. The Stoic idea describes the principle by which the universe came into existence through the Logos, the personified idea through which creation has brought into existence. John says, through Christ. Christ is that Logos. That may be the Greek philosophers in the 6th century we're talking about. That's everything on our Greek philosophy, and really that's most of all I know about Greek philosophy. But if there are any questions about that or what we did talk about, I'll go ahead and address those now. Okay, well, if that's the case, then I have something I'd like to read. If you remember from our first class, I talked about the emails that were in the book. So there's some fictional emails written from a fictional professor to a fictional student. And they're kind of to help us understand a little bit better. So this one is pretty interesting. It's about the Gnostics. So if you've read anything about the early church, the church fathers, and they're battling with Gnosticism, you may have come across that. Well, I didn't quite understand all the things it talked about either. So this is a short email I'd like to read to you. The student starts by saying, "Dear Professor, I keep coming across the reference to Gnosticism in some of the textbooks. Am I right in thinking that Gnosticism is mainly about salvation through a secret and special knowledge?" The professor writes back, "Dear Alan, on Gnosticism, no, that's not quite the full story. The problem is that Gnosticism is quite a slippery and misunderstood term. For a start, the Gnostics did not know that they were Gnostics. It was not their own designation for themselves. It was a designation given to them by others. On top of that, the Gnostics were diverse, so diverse, in fact, that some scholars wondered if we can even talk about a homogeneous religion system known as Gnosticism. Among the many groups that are identified as Gnostics, yes, there is a big emphasis on esoteric knowledge, especially of weird cosmologies and deities that duplicate and descend on earth. However, the more common feature is demiurgal creationism. Don't let that term scare you. A demiurgal creationism is basically the belief that the world was created by a wicked demiurge who made yucky things like matter with all of its evil, while Jesus is another God who came to save us from the demiurge and his wicked world. In other words, Gnosticism separates the God of creation from the God of redemption. The real motivation in Gnosticism is theodicy, explaining why a God who is good would make a world like this, filled with so much evil, suffering, and death. The Gnostic answer is that God didn't make the world. It was a lesser and wicked deity who made the world, and the good God comes to save people from the world of bodies and matter. This salvation begins when we approach the true knowledge of our primordial origins. The origins of Gnosticism are disputed, but it probably derives from the Jewish interface with Middle Platonism, as interpreted through biblical traditions, sometimes after the second century Jewish revolt of AD 132 to 135, when some Jews began looking into Greek philosophy for a way of making sense of the world. This seems to have been taken up by Christian leaders like Valentinus and Marcion in the second century. And then they say to dig deeper, and they recommend a couple of books. If you're interested in Gnosticism and learning more about that, I'll be happy to get those to you, those books it references. So before we move on, is there any questions on that, on the email or Gnosticism? Okay, so on to the Jewish diaspora. This is a term you may have heard lots of times, the Jewish diaspora, not only in the Bible. It doesn't really come up a lot in the Bible, but there were Jews living everywhere among the world in the time of the Bible. In fact, they say 80% in the first century, 80% of Jews probably were living outside of Palestine. If you did your homework this last couple of weeks and watched Fiddler on the Roof, that was a community of Jews living in Russia, right? And it was a completely different place from where they were from, cut off from their homeland. But this is how Jews have lived for a long time in lots of different places. The historian and geographer Strabo once said that before the time of Jesus, he said, "This people, the Jews, has already made its way into every city, and it is not easy to find any place in the habitable world that has not received this nation, in which it has not made its power felt." The Jewish diaspora happened for lots of different reasons. It happened on one hand because of the conquest from places like Babylon and Assyria, and the deportation of the tribes and the people into every different city among the world. It also happened because Jews left on purpose in order to seek economic opportunity, to maybe a job that made more money somewhere else. Maybe they also left for family ties and connections elsewhere. Wherever Jews went, the one thing was certain: they took their scriptures with them. Taking their scriptures ensured that even though they weren't in Jerusalem, they weren't in the temple, they could at least read the scriptures in community with one another and be in the presence of God. This is where a lot of the Jews became Hellenized among the world, because going into different parts of the world, as we saw on our first map, most of the parts they would have went were Greek. And so they would have become Hellenized through being separated. Now, why the diaspora led to many Jews being cut off and separated from their home, it also led to a world that was diffused into the Jewish tradition and culture, a diffusion of Jewish beliefs and practices. Josephus, the famous Jewish historian, he boasted once that the masses, having long since shown a keen desire to adopt our religious observances, and there is not one city, Greek or barbarian, nor a single nation to which our customs of abstaining from work on the seventh day has not spread, and where the fast and the lighting of lamps and many of our prohibitions in the matter of food are not observed. There was basically two answers to the Jewish diaspora. Either people saw what they were doing and they envied it. They took it on for themselves. Things like keeping the Sabbath, remembering a day to remind yourself that you are not in control of everything, that God is the one that provides for you. You're not the one who provides all the things you have, but God does. Things like the fast, the lighting of lamps, keeping the feasts is what he's referring to. And even the kosher food laws. People were taking them up. Now, the other response to the Jewish diaspora was hatred. There's plenty of accounts of Romans who detested the Jews, mainly because they set themselves apart. The Jews didn't eat with non-Jews. They didn't sleep among non-Jews. They didn't marry Jewish women or non-Jewish women or non-Jewish men. They used their religion to divide themselves from their other cultures. They didn't worship the pantheon. The Jewish influence was widespread through the ancient world, and many Jews believed that this was intended by God to spread the knowledge of the living God to the world, which it certainly had the effect of doing. We're almost done here. There's just one more thing I want to go over, and that's the Septuagint that we talked about earlier. So, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. We talked about that already. Now, according to legend, Ptolemy II, which was the king of Egypt, the Greek king of Egypt at the time after Alexander's death, Ptolemy II commissioned 70 scholars to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Now, these 70 scholars were doing it in order to have a copy of a Greek Old Testament in the Library of Alexandria. A famous library, scholars from all around the world came to study and learn the Library of Alexandria. So, this is the legend. We're not quite sure if it's true or not. It doesn't seem that we have a copy of the Septuagint as such. In fact, there was no copy for us that the Jews of the first century could carry around of a Greek Old Testament. What we have today are small pieces and manuscripts of different Greek translations, and we combine these together to make what we call the Septuagint. Often, the Septuagint is symbolized with the LXX. If you've ever seen that, LXX, that's a nod towards the 70 scholars who apparently wrote the Septuagint, because that's Roman numerals for 70, right? This Greek translation was never a single translation that the first century Jews could carry around. It's an eclectic Greek manuscript that contained parts of the Old Testament and also other books along with it, like First Esdras, the Maccabees, and the Prayer of Manasseh were often put along with these Old Testament texts. What we do know is that the New Testament authors like Luke and Paul and most of the other ones also quoted the Septuagint, not necessarily the Hebrew Scriptures. In the Greek manuscripts we have, they used the actual Greek words that were in the Septuagint itself, pointing to the fact that they probably were reading their Bibles in Greek very often. Now, it wasn't until much later that the Greek Septuagint was replaced with the Latin Vulgate. This was written by Jerome in the 4th century. The Latin Vulgate means the commonly used Vulgate. That's because it became the most widely known and used Bible after the time of Jerome. The Latin-speaking people used it for a long time. That's why even to this day, if you go to a service at the Vatican in Rome, you'll hear their liturgy, everything in Latin. They still, to this day, use copies of the Latin Vulgate. Now, the Latin Vulgate was translated in 1611 into what many of us probably have at home or with us today, the King James Bible. So, if you look at the King James Bible, what you have is a translation from the Latin Vulgate, which was translated from the Greek Septuagint, which was translated from the Hebrew Scriptures. So, this is some reason that a lot of people don't like to use the King James Bible primarily. Also, it was translated in 1611. We speak a little differently than they did in 1611, right? And so a lot of people maybe aren't as used to that language. But on the other hand, many people are simply used to their King James Bible and don't want to trade it for anything else. One thing that I like to use, and I always suggest, is the New King James Bible, because while it has a lot of similar wording, the New King James was proofed against the original Hebrew text. Jerome actually says later in his life that he did go back and check the original Hebrew to see how great his translation was. Whether he did or not, we're not sure. I tend to think he probably did. But one way or the other, the Latin Vulgate is a translation of a translation. And so the Septuagint was a little bit more reliable at that time for the Greek-speaking world. And that's what a lot of our New Testament writers used. Luckily, today, we have lots of translations that we can use. And even on your phone, you probably have 40, 50, I don't know how many translations, right? And so there's always good to use. Maybe if you're familiar with the wording of one, you go to another one, and it maybe makes you think a little bit more, right? And so that's always a good tip for Bible study. Which leads me to your homework for next 2 weeks. Once again, this one's easy. It doesn't even take 3 hours, I promise. So for this next 2 weeks, I would encourage you to go home and open up the preface of your Bible and read the preface. Many of us probably have lots of prefaces of books and Bibles that we've never read. What that preface tells you is a little bit about how your Bible was translated from the Greek and from the Hebrew and into your modern language today. And so it's good to know, just to understand how that was done and how reliable it might be. We have terms like word for word and thought for thought translations, and that'll shed a little bit of light on that as well. So that's really all I had for this afternoon. I appreciate, once again, your attention and you being here. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask now. Well, if that's all, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.